Welcome to the Nerd Party.
Hi, this is Henry Gilroy, co-executive producer of Star Wars Rebels. You're listening to Aggressive Negotiations.
Welcome to Aggressive Negotiations, coming at you live from Lothal. I have to say, I love being back on Lothal. It's really nice since they've fixed everything up. You know, once the Empire was gone, it's a great planet. So I am just one of your hosts here, Matthew Rushing, and with me, as he is always, just the phenomenally wonderful, talented, brilliant, and, well, just a joy to be around, Jedi Master John Mills.
Well, all of those things are untrue, but I appreciate you saying them. Thank you, Matt. I am tickled pink to be here, taking a journey back to Lothal to heap some praise and some retrospective thoughts on one heck of an animated show, as it turned out.
Can you believe that it's been... In fact, this is the coolest part about this. As we're recording, we will be dropping this show the day that the last episode aired 1 year ago. That is so crazy to think.
It is crazy to think because I still remember getting a little weepy during that last episode. Look, we're going to be in full-on spoiler territory. If you've not watched Rebels, this is one where you're going to have to finish the series because I don't think that there's any way to talk about this because what I'm about to say, I got weepy through that whole ending, and then when I saw her in that ending, it was the most joy I've felt for a character showing up on screen in a long time. Like I was so overjoyed to see Ahsoka in her full-on garb at the end. It was just magnificent, wonderful stuff.
It was a presence I'd not felt in...
Oh, my goodness. It was...
so good.
Yes, it was so good. And what's so good, of course, is that everybody finds us on the Nerd Party. Nerdparty.com/contact. You can find Aggressive Negotiations and send us a note. And you can find the show at the Jedi Masters on Twitter. You can find the network's account at Join Nerd Party. You can find the Nerd Party on Facebook and Instagram. And, of course, please feel free to give us a rating and review and or subscribe to us on a whole host of services from Apple Podcasts, also known as iTunes, to Spreaker, to Spotify, to iHeartRadio. We're everywhere you want to be. So give us a subscribe and follow along. And if this is your first episode of Aggressive Negotiations, to you we say welcome.
We do say welcome. John, I want to go back in the Wayback Machine, and I want to ask you, for that first episode of Rebels, for the first season of Rebels, what did you think of the show?
I was very standoffish about it. I'm pretty sure we talked about this over on 602 Club previously. Because we would do those season retrospectives in the early days.
Yes.
And I remember it wasn't a feeling of being underwhelmed per se, but it was a feeling of, It was disorienting, and I think it's because, and I fully acknowledge that at least part of it was I had such a love of the Clone Wars, and its cancellation still hurt.
Yeah.
That going into it, I didn't get that same high. What about you?
I remember the very first episode, because they did basically the intro movie for everyone, which was great. Spark of Rebellion was, I think, a good way to introduce everyone to the show. And I think it was pretty well done. I think the moment that you get... you know, you have that amazing moment where Kanan pulls out his lightsaber for the first time, and he's like, "Kid, I'm about to let everybody in on the secret." And it's just such a, I mean, that is a great moment, you know, and it's I think, a really fantastic way to kind of sell the beginning of this show. So I had good feelings, I think, for the first episode. And then that first season kind of felt like it middled around a little bit. And I don't know. My guess is, I could be completely wrong, but my guess is that some of that is the Disney influence that, you know, I think maybe Dave might have had to wade through till he could kind of go where he wanted to. And I think that it really started to pick up steam by the end of the season. And then, of course, the moment that Ahsoka walks down the ladder, we're going to talk about a lot of Ahsoka moments, because I think she really sold that for me. Okay, this is where this show is. Like, it was such a mind-blowing moment when it's her walking down that ladder. And my wife can attest, I actually jumped up off the couch and kind of did a little dance because I was so excited that, well, at least for that moment, the question had been answered, that Ahsoka lives.
Yes. Before that, see, in the first season, I agree with you. It's very much finding its way. And it was easy to forget because Clone Wars had gone on for long enough that Clone Wars had its, you know, I think Clone Wars had a stronger beginning, but it too, you know, felt its way around a little bit. I think it was helped by the fact that it wasn't a linear storyline with Clone Wars. So you didn't have a whole arc to have to try to get into. It popped around, you know, and I really liked that about the release order of Clone Wars, and I think it did help. But with Rebels, it was uneasy sailing for me until the mid-season break, which is when they went to the Jedi Temple. And that was the first moment where I felt, oh, okay, we're connecting here. We're not just building a new crew. We're tying this into the bigger story. And yeah, you know, I know that some people are not enamored of the idea of that, of feeling that it's obligated, I guess, from their point of view. But this story doesn't exist in a vacuum. And so knowing where it is in its place in the firmament, that was very helpful in the first season.
Well, and I think, you know, I really like you calling that out, because I completely agree with you. You know, the moment we went to the temple and, you know, we had an introduction to Yoda in the show. You know, they brought Frank Oz back to do Yoda as well. They were able to get him, which was fantastic. And I think there's a real sense at that point that, yes, they want to do the same thing that Clone Wars did, which was, we're going to use Star Wars mythology to tell our stories, you know? And I think that was a moment that really keyed me into, yeah, we are not going to forget the fact that we are part of the Star Wars mythos, and we're going to connect where we can and when we can to those bigger, larger arcs. I think, you know, it's so fascinating to me because one of the things that the show does so well is it straddles the fact that it has its own identity. This is the story of these rebels, but it also is able to carry forth the story of the rebellion and these characters, and to service people like a Rex or a Ahsoka or those places where you could connect back with Clone Wars and kind of create this nice cohesion between prequel trilogy and original trilogy. And, you know, even then too, working with Rogue One. So it just, and then of course the way that Solo ends up working with all of this too, it's like you have this wonderful palette that brought all of those things together in a way that, you know, I think was George's original idea with the Clone Wars for what it would do for the prequel trilogy. And I think Dave saw the opportunity there to do the same thing for the dark times, you know?
And I think that it's also important to call out that it's not just being a, you know, a quote unquote, the popular pejorative, a fanboy and saying that we, you, whomever, well, I got to know all of these things in relation to galactic politics and everything. I think that once they started bringing those elements in, I think that the show actually got more comfortable with itself. The characterizations of the main characters became more organic and fluid, and I think that's specifically because there was no weight to them that it's because there was no great dramatic weight to them before those moments. And I think that once you give the story and the characters that canvas, those guide rails, this is where you are, I think that at that point the characterizations started getting clearer and more distinct for all of the characters. They were no longer just characters that were there together on screen. They started coming together as a family, which is what they were always intended to be, a space family. But I think that having that greater sense of place and purpose helped make that more fluid and dynamic.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the most interesting things too was, I think Sabine is a really good example of this, which is, for so much of this series, I felt like we waited and waited and waited to try and kind of figure out this character. And there were a few moments where I felt like, oh, wow, she has a really complicated and like, it feels like very full backstory for a girl of like, the age of 16 or something. And they really brought it all together, though, in those later seasons when we started to connect to Mandalore and we started to connect to her family and we started to connect Mandalore and what had happened after whatever happened in the Clone Wars. We know the Siege of Mandalore happened from the beginning of the Ahsoka book, and, hopefully we'll get that in the Clone Wars. But, she's a character where I feel like each one of these characters gets a great arc, and hers I felt like maybe took possibly the longest to finally see come to fruition. But each one of the characters, and she just happens to, I think, to be the best example of this, is just we really went somewhere with each of them. We took them on a journey, and each one of the characters, except for maybe Chopper, who pretty much ends up staying the same. It's kind of like R2, not a lot of journey there, but he helps along the way for everybody else. But each one gets their own unique, specific journey, which is so special in a show like this. And I think, Dave found a way to really, the Clone Wars have this big, massive canvas where we're dealing with all of these different Jedi, but we are focusing on kind of these main characters, but we'll still focus on a lot of other stuff. Here it really was about this family, being a family, like you said, and their journey together. And each one of them kind of had a very unique arc. And I thought, Sabine just being a great example of how special that became by the time you got to the end of the series. And the fact that when you got to the very end of the series, you mentioned this at the very beginning of the show, and she's the one standing there. She did what she promised Ezra she would do. She helped protect his planet, and now she will go and find him. And it was just like, it's such a beautiful thing to see that play out. And that's what I think made Rebels so Star Wars, because it created these indelible characters which you can't imagine not existing now in Star Wars. And that's what I think makes for the best Star Wars characters. Like, I can't imagine there not being Sabine or Hera or Zeb or, any of them, Kanan, Ezra, like, that's amazing.
Well, and there's even a redemption arc with Callus, which is a hallmark of Star Wars, that even the bad guys can become good again. And that people can get, their allegiances can be tested, and when even if they're supporting something bad, it takes love and patience sometimes just to get them to see the error of their ways. And I think that's a super important thread with the show. And I think that one of the things that I really loved about it was it continued to challenge my perceptions of the way certain things worked. And I mean that specifically in terms of the Inquisitor, the Grand Inquisitor at first, and then the Inquisitors themselves. That was something fresh and interesting that I loved encountering.
No, I could not agree with you more. I thought that was such an interesting thing for us to dive into, this idea that, they're helping Vader and that created great tension, which they used in the Vader comic, which I loved as well. And just that whole idea of, taking these ex-Jedi and or, Force-sensitive children, which we saw all the way back in the Clone Wars, right? The fact that, Palpatine had been doing experiments on them, basically. So, I just thought, what a fantastic way to kind of expound on that. And then, I think, too, it's a really good story idea. I think this is something that Henry Gilroy has talked about, and is that whole... And Dave mentioned as well, you can't have Vader going after them all the time and not get them, or be foiled by them and have him look weak. So it's better to have these type of characters where you can, beat up on them, and it makes our characters look better, but it doesn't make somebody like Vader look weaker, and that's never what we want on the show. And so as a storytelling aspect, it's such a great idea.
And the fact that they were willing... there were so many ways in the first season, even though it didn't completely have me, when it did start figuring its way, the fact that they were willing to kill the Grand Inquisitor was stunning to me, because that is one of those things where it actually winds up translating to danger for all of the characters. Nobody's safe. If you're willing to kill a character that I've seen marketed 6 ways from Sunday, and he's got the giant action figure standees, and he's, his lightsaber is a toy, and I see action figures for him everywhere, and you kill him after one season. Wow. That means things are going to be getting pretty interesting here. And even, his dying sentiment as he goes, and he says something far worse is coming. Like that was such a great setup too. Where, you think I was bad. Oh, wait until you see what you got to deal with. It's a really, poetic thing. And then just the fact that the Inquisitors themselves were so interesting and so distinct on their own. Seventh sister and fifth brother, just what do those names even mean? What is that? Is she number 7? He's number 5? Are there a ton of brothers and a ton of sisters? Like that whole thing where just a name can make you question everything that's going on is such a cool aspect to it. And I think that it's one of those things where this is a classic example of a show that got better as it went in the most important ways, where the later seasons made the stuff I didn't really care for in the earlier seasons better, and made me appreciate it and want to bring it along for the ride.
I mean, if you find a way to redeem Puffer Pigs and Purgle episodes,
yes,
it's and I think that there's a real genius in that, because I remember last year, before Dragon Con, because I was doing the final panel with Henry about Rebels ending, so I watched through the entire series as quick as I could, and that was something that I noticed is how many things that you saw that we would consider like throwaway episodes would end up playing out later on, and that there was kind of they didn't forget that, and I think that's really smart. Now there's still a few episodes here and there where it's like I could have done without that one, but that's part of every single show, no matter what it is. It could be the best show ever, but I've never seen it, but I'm pretty sure there's episodes of Breaking Bad where you're like, it wasn't the best episode, but whatever.
They tend to be in the first season, ironically. That's when they were still figuring out what type of show they wanted to be. Yeah.
So I think that's something that this show, like you said, it did really well. And on top of that, I think this show, along with what we got in Rogue One, which they made for nice pairings anyway, we really, I think, create a super scary Darth Vader.
Oh, yeah.
I feel like he gets back that mantle of being the scariest villain. Just the way, even that episode where, they're fighting Vader and he's just like tossing them left and right. And, they pull down the walkers on him and he's just lifting them up. And it's just like, okay, this guy is as scary as it gets now again. And then, we carried that forward again to Rogue One and that moment there. And you're just like, okay, the power radiating off of this guy is just off the chain, So I think that's one of the things I really appreciated when they did use characters like a Vader or a Tarkin or, these legacy characters like that, or the Emperor when we see him. They use them just magnificently. Like, Dave understands how to use these characters and make them that nightmare that you remember as a kid, watching the original trilogy for the first time.
I think something super interesting is that over time we've lost sight of the real terror of Vader and the real danger and darkness of the Empire. Yes, we all know Empire Strikes Back as the dark one, blah, 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 all that stuff. I'm talking about Vader became an embraced anti-hero. Some of his menace wore off, and he became almost like a pet bad guy, emotionally speaking. But Rebels shows how the Empire didn't immediately become the Empire we encounter in Star Wars and Empire Strikes Back and Return of the Jedi, that it took time to get there. And so it makes sense to see Vader's power like on an upswing at this point, that he is starting to hit the zenith of his power, and these characters are the first ones unfortunate enough to run across him when they do. And it does, I think, add a lot of menace to the galaxy, and then pays forward, and knowing everything with Thrawn that's involved in this show, and the fact that there was a competing program with the Death Star, that's such an interesting thing, because now you look at the Death Star and you say, wow, would things have gone differently if Thrawn's program had been funded and all of those sorts of things? That's a super cool thing to have to sit there and ponder and say, oh, wow, would Thrawn really have beaten everybody? And on top of that, here's this animated series bringing back a character that we'd all had to say goodbye to, and bringing him back in an amazing way and making him ridiculously scary. And everything that he was like Heath Ledger's Joker. There was never really an expression of the Joker that was quite like that before Heath Ledger. But once Heath Ledger did that Joker, you said, that's the guy that was always in my head. That one. That's the guy. And this Thrawn is exactly like that, where he walks on screen and the way he talks and moves, you say, that's the guy that I had in my head when I was reading those books back then. Him.
Yeah, I loved the fact that, we brought back a character into canon like Thrawn. And what I loved is that I feel like, in many ways, and I don't know if Zahn would agree, but just from my personal opinion, I feel like he was able to add dimensions to Thrawn that weren't necessarily there before. And part of that is that he isn't quite a bad guy, but he's not a good guy either. He really is somebody who has this really gray center. And what he's doing is for motivations that are honorable, right? He's actually trying to protect his own people. But by doing so, he's also propping up this, horrible empire. And the fact that he's willing to do that is and rationalize it, is one of the things that makes him so scary, that cold logic. And I almost feel like, he kind of becomes the villain then, that because he only really uses logic, you can logic anything, right? And that's what we see, is that Thrawn can logic just about anything.
And what's beautiful about the way they brought him back in as well is the fact that the ancillary books, Zahn getting to rewrite him, absolutely work, and I love them. I've sung their praises. But the Thrawn on screen isn't reliant on them. If I never touched those new Thrawn books, I would still have been really happy with the way Thrawn was on screen. I didn't need that extra material. It's great to have, and it supports it, and it makes sense, and it plugs in, and it enriches the story. But they had some terrific voice work for him, and just some really terrific arcs where they were able to use him as a foil. And like goes back to the Clone Wars, but it also goes to the Inquisitors. He gives an added dimension to what we've seen before about how the Empire works and how Vader works and how the Emperor works. Like Thrawn gives specific subtextual information about how things work because of the problems he faces operating within this system that has people like Tarkin. And you see how diverse, really, the motivations can be for everybody.
And I think one of the things that he really does, too, is that he also becomes a character that helps us see why the Empire won't last, why the Emperor's plan is flawed, because the way the Emperor has everybody kind of continually going at each other's throats isn't something that's sustainable over a long period of time. Yes, that's sustainable when you only have two, right? The rule of two.
Mm-hmm.
It's not sustainable when you have like thousands of people in an empire doing it around the galaxy to each other. That dog-eat-dog world just doesn't work. And so I really appreciate the way that Thrawn helps bring that to light. And by bringing him in as a character here, we do get to explore the Empire in a totally new way. And we see all these machinations and these things that are happening. And, it's very interesting to me because an Empire under Thrawn probably would have lasted, hundreds of years. Whereas an Empire under the Emperor, under Palpatine, 30 years?
Well, I mean, it's that whole idea of Thrawn. It really is a different sort of, you see his view being, it's just a different way to play. The Emperor is personal power, smash mouth. He just wants to overwhelm everybody. Thrawn is the one that's fine with killing his opponents, death by 1,000 cuts. The Emperor just wants to blow you away. Now, the Emperor's gamble doesn't pay off, but if it had, he still would have won. But that's the problem, is his gamble is so huge, whereas Thrawn's gamble is a little bit at a time. It's the difference between somebody who bets everything on the big hand of poker and the person who's sitting there measuring their bets, watching the players, watching the cards, and maybe they fold this hand and you say, I won this hand, but he's got more money in the bank. He's waiting, and he's figuring out your tells and stuff like that. That's such a magnificent quality to Thrawn.
I think on top of Thrawn, the things that amazed me about Rebels that were completely shocking were the ways in which Dave expounded upon the Force and the things that we added, like the world between worlds and the idea of that connection. And how what I loved is that when Yoda tells Luke that the Force is what surrounds us and it binds the galaxy together, that we have literally seen what binds the galaxy together and how deep that goes, what that actually means. And how still so esoteric it is that I don't truly completely understand it, and that's wonderful. Like,
Yeah.
it's a mystery to which I don't truly want explained. I just love the fact that it's there.
Yeah, I was actually talking today because I was talking with a colleague at lunch, and I mentioned how we were going to be discussing Rebels, and he said to me, "Oh, I never finished it," and I didn't name it, and I didn't say World Between Worlds, and I said, "Oh, please, you've got to finish the show because there's something that happens in the 4th season that's going to blow your mind." And he looked at me and he said, "Really?" I said, Please, trust me on this one. You're going to get to an episode that happens where you're going to sit there and say, what philosophy class do I need to take to understand? Like, it's that cool. And World Between Worlds, seeing the father, the sister, and the son again in that glorious, like, I want a poster version of that.
That'd be so great. That
mosaic,
mural.
The mural.
Yes.
I want it. I want it now. I would pay, like, if it's at Star Wars Celebration, which I'm not going to, if somebody sees it there, I will pay you back. Get it to me. I want that hanging on my wall because I looked at that thing and when I saw it, I didn't just say, oh my gosh, it's them. The first words out of my mouth were, oh my gosh, that's beautiful. It's such real artwork. And that's one of the things that I love about Rebels' style is, myself included, I was a little hard on it at the beginning, but I came to appreciate the fact that they were able to find a way to have their own style and at the same time elevate it as they went and get it to a place that was truly unique and special, enough so that when we meet Maul again, Maul is the Maul we've always seen, but he's a little bit different. Like, it's such a fresh way to see a character that you've known for so long. Even though I remember watching the final confrontation between Obi-Wan and Maul, I was a little rough on that episode when it first aired, but it's one that really stuck with me. It's one of the ones that's really stayed with me the whole time, especially because their final confrontation was so poetic and so gorgeous, of the two warriors who, and I'm cribbing from Filoni himself, I think, where he said, people said, what? There's only one hit. And he said, these guys have fought each other so much, they just go right to the final move. They've played out the entire thing in their heads, and they're just going to the final move. And that's, Obi-Wan is just able to get there faster than he was. And it's just such a brilliant moment in the series.
Well, and in that moment, you have Obi-Wan who has learned, and you have Maul that has not. And that's the difference between the two characters, is that Obi-Wan has matured, has grown, has become a better person. Maul has continually stayed in this angry stupor that has not allowed him to move forward in any way, shape, or form. And I think, that's the thing that
that's also
really makes that so special.
That's also an important thing that winds up highlighting with Vader, is Vader does change. Vader does become worse over time. And so you could even say that that's the reason Vader's able to beat Obi-Wan, whereas, yes, I know Obi-Wan sacrifices himself, all of those sorts of things, but Vader progresses to a different state of being, a more evil, deeper in the dark side of the Force state of being, whereas, to your point, Maul plateaued a while back and never got past it, never could grow past it. And that, in and of itself, you could wind up doing a compare-contrast with Maul and Vader at that point in their lives and try to figure out, okay, why was he able to advance and he was... I mean, Maul's a broken person, completely broken. Anakin's broken, too. In what way are they the same and different? And look at that. It's just
That sounds like a good show idea.
Yeah. And that's just here from Star Wars Rebels, you know?
So one of the things that I think I really responded to in this show is the fact that the voice cast made these characters so lovable. And, you know, I think it would, you know, we'd be remiss if we did not talk about these incredible voice actors. You know, I think the one that surprised me the most at the beginning was Freddie Prinze Jr.
Yes.
And, you know, just because growing up, and Freddie, if you're listening, you know, loved you in films like, you know, She's All That and that kind of thing. So that's kind of how I saw him. But there's something about the way that he played this character of Kanan, starting off as kind of the cowboy and then slowly becoming more of somebody that we would kind of see as a Jedi Master, basically. And that progression and the way that his voice changes in those moments where, you know, he's just having the heart-to-hearts with Hera and Ezra, you know, those kind of places where the episode Trial of the Darksaber, where he's training Sabine, you know, these moments that I think he just brought out the best of whoever he was playing off of. You know, there's just something really special about him, and you know, today I would rank him one of my all-time favorite Jedi. Like, if I'm making a list of the top 5, Kanan's actually going to be in that list.
Yeah, I'm there with you, and I think it's a very worthwhile. I mean, we're not going to sit here and read off like a whole cast list, although we could, but it's a very appropriate thing to point out how key the right voice cast and the right direction, therefore, is to these performances. It is harder to sell an animated character than people think. And it's way too easy for people to underestimate the work and talent that a voice actor brings. And I think that Rebels is a beautiful case study in finding the right voices and giving them the right direction to make those characters come alive. Everybody all the way from, you know, Kanan and Hera all the way down to Chopper, who had a surprise voice that we found out afterward. But yeah, he, I mean, it's just all to say, having that right voice talent there and going the extra mile, even in the case of getting Ian McDiarmid to come back and voice the Emperor again, because it helps sell that character just right. And I would argue that with Clone Wars, you know, that takes nothing away from the tremendous voice talent there that brought the Emperor to life. But I am thinking that it winds up helping even here, because the Emperor is so much closer to that Star Wars Return of the Jedi time period that the people you've picked up along the way who weren't Clone Wars fans, that voice becomes a little bit more important to them. Does that make sense?
No, I think it does. I mean, I think it's the reason that you get Frank Oz to do Yoda too for the times that he's on the show.
Yeah,
I think that makes a difference. You know, the cast of the show is, I mean, incredible. You know, Taylor Gray was amazing. I loved actually the fact that he wasn't a massive Star Wars fan. You know, when this came on, he didn't really know that much, and so the relationship he had with Freddie became very much that kind of master-apprentice relationship, and I think that really comes across on screen. You know, Vanessa Marshall is Hera, is one of my all-time favorite characters now in Star Wars. I think she's just incredible in what she does with her talent, voice-wise. Tia Sircar is you know, Sabine is just a wonderful actress. And the fact that she's playing somebody who's younger, she does it so well. I never don't buy the fact that this is a girl that's 16 to 17 years old. Steve Blum as Zeb is just he's so vivacious and fun.
My quest for a Zeb action figure that's reasonably priced is, I'm flummoxed, man. I'm still, I'm a little irritated.
Figures are hard to come by at a cheap price because they did not put a lot of them, and so that was really frustrating.
Well, you'd think with Galaxy's Edge opening up, and we know that Hondo Onaka is going to be there. Hopefully that means maybe we're going to get another crack at some of those things.
I mean, let's hope so. Although I do know that the Black Series figures, you're getting they're bringing out an Ezra and a Chopper soon, and all they need left is Zeb, and you can have the whole crew. So,
all right.
Yeah, that'd be great. But yeah, I mean, I think this is one of the things that Rebels was able to do. The entire show ends up becoming something that I fell in love with, and it went from a place where I started with skepticism, and it became something that became a love of mine in the Star Wars saga. And I think that just speaks for the quality of the show and what it was able to do, the direction that it took under people like Filoni and Gilroy and the rest of the writers there, making sure that this show fit within the Star Wars canon, but also, again, like Clone Wars, added something to it. And I think part of the thing that they did, a lot of us expected at the end that basically the Rebels in this show, they would be the Death Star plan stealing Rebels, right? And I think the thing that Dave did that I really appreciated is that this show was about their journey, and their journey was wrapped around this planet of Lothal that not only was important, that became important in a way that we didn't even understand until the very end when we got to the World Between Worlds, and we realize what it is, that this is basically another Death Star, but worse, basically. If Palpatine can get his hands on this, he could irrevocably destroy the galaxy in a way that, may never return in the way we want it to. So I just think there's a real genius in that. Of not giving in to, and obviously Rogue One already was going to go there, but we just did something special, and I really appreciate it.
Yeah, I think that it serves the added story bonus it serves the added story purpose of illustrating that just because all of the rebel factions weren't united by this point, it doesn't mean people weren't doing things. The rebellion is still forming. And I think that is great because our encounter with these characters isn't just about being a cog in a bigger... As much as we praise, it gave them a place in the galaxy and a role to play in galactic events. Yes, it did do that, but it didn't do it just to have them be a throwaway story element. Their story was not... inevitable in any sense of the word. It felt very much organic as a result.
There's another aspect of the show that I think is really fascinating, which is I really appreciated in the end a lot of the themes that Kiner was able to create for the show.
Yeah.
Music-wise. And I think once they kind of let him off the leash to where he wasn't trying to, basically ape the original series music all the time. The stuff that he came up with for this show was just phenomenal, hands down, amazing, and actually became some of the best themes that I think we've had in Star Wars in a long time. I mean, next to what we got with Solo, next to what we got with Rogue One, I really appreciate the music that was created in Rebels, and it's really a travesty that seasons 3 and 4 do not have an official soundtrack release. The only place you can really hear that music is to go over to Kiner's website, because this deserves, this whole series really deserves full soundtrack releases in the sense of like picking out the best themes he was able to create, because it's great stuff.
Yeah, it did become great. I think the sound design of the show as a whole was really solid. And that in and of itself warms my heart, because we all know how important sound has always been to the Star Wars galaxy. But, so the music, but also the sound design itself was just a little bit different and just right. And it still sounded like Star Wars without being boring to the ear, and having interesting moments like that whistling noise on the planes that sounded like that light, that still small voice calling out to somebody. That sort of stuff was really, really special.
I mean, you mentioned the fact that we connect with the rebellion at large. We actually see Mon Mothma make her speech.
We get to see Saw Gerrera.
The schisms with Saw Gerrera.
Yeah.
I think all of that's phenomenal. But I think this all comes back, it really comes back to this planet, this planet of Lothal, the specialness of it, and things like I'd never thought that we would see, wolves that talk, that time travel, well, space travel, time travel, kind of the same thing.
Yeah, time and space.
It's just, I think there's something about this show where it was able to do those kind of crazy ideas. And to me, it made them work, and it never stopped feeling like Star Wars.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's the cherry on top of the sundae right there. That's absolutely right.
Well, John, I think we could continue to talk about Rebels for a very long time. This is a show I think that would be really fun to kind of go back and rewatch and talk about through, with all of the extra textual knowledge, and being able to kind of connect it all together, because it really does work like that, especially since, as you mentioned, this one is so linear. Really cool. But if anybody wants to catch up with you, their favorite Rebels memories, as we're talking about Rebels Remembered, where can they catch up with you?
Oh, well, just look for Kessel Junkie. I'm on Twitter, Letterboxd, Goodreads, KESSELJUNKIE. You can also find me right here on the network, co-hosting a show called Retro Perspective with Mike Schindler, where we are going through the year of 1994 week by week, celebrating the 25th anniversary of everything that was both memorable and forgettable and emotionally scarring to endure in 1994. Everything from Steven Seagal to Michael J. Fox and Quentin Tarantino and beyond. So tune into that. But Matt, where can people locate you if they get lost on the plains of Lothal?
Well, you can find me and my furry wolf friends on Twitter, Instagram, and Letterboxd under the name MattRushing02. You can also find me here on the network talking about Harry Potter each and every week with Drea Kaufman over on Owl Post, one chapter at a time. I am doing a couple of shows on the Trek FM network. One is called The Orb with Chris Jones talking about Star Trek Deep Space Nine. I do the General Geek Show with my co-host Christy Morris. As every week we dive into a fandom that we love. Just finished talking about the second movie in the Mission Impossible series, as we're slowly moving through the beginning films we haven't covered yet, so that's been fun. And you just never know what we're going to talk about. Although I'll give you a hint, the next week we're talking about Ron Howard's Willow. Ooh. So that should be a good show. And then last but not least, you can find me doing Cinema Stories, my good friend Courtney, where we talk about films through the lens of faith. And, I encourage anybody who's interested. We just talked about Rogue One on the show, so check that out. But, John, I think with all that said, I think it's time to head back to the temple and close negotiations.
Master Rushing, negotiations are closed.
Join the revolution. Join the Nerd Party.